In the early 1800s, just before the Civil War, there was a lot of pressure of white settlers coming into these Appalachian states, Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina and those states along the southern edge of the Gulf there. And the Creek Indians, of course, were having issues of their land being taken away, so the United States started to pressure them, and eventually they demanded that they relocate from those lands. Well, over the course of about 20 or 25 years, those Indians started to run away and come south and live in Florida and hide in Florida. So the word Seminole is really a word that means runaway in Spanish, and they got that name because of the fact that they were running away. Once the sewing machine came into being, which was in the late 1800s, the Seminole Indians very quickly learned to sew. The women started to develop what's known as patchwork, which is similar to our quilting style, and they would make very elaborate patchwork clothing, and they would have competitions among members of the tribes as to who could make the most beautiful patchwork clothing. All Native Americans live off the land, so they eat whatever is present there. The Seminoles became very adept at alligator hunting and later on alligator wrestling. They found that that was a niche for tourists coming to southern Florida who came to visit them on the reservation, so they did alligator wrestling, and they did that very well. It was pretty inevitable that there were going to be some clashes of culture, naturally, and the Seminole tribe members were eating and raising the cattle that the Spanish had left behind. They thought cattle was free, they just would take cattle anywhere that they found them. But Americans had a different view. They thought cattle should be owned by individual families. So this cattle issue ultimately resulted in a series of skirmishes called the Seminole Wars. They weren't really big wars, like big battles with huge numbers of people, but it was over this cattle issue that the Seminole tribes just said that these are our cows, and the Americans said these are our cows. And the skirmishes wound up, a number of people were killed, mostly settlers. The Seminole tribe knew the land and, had guns by then. So they never did resolve it, and they remain unconquered to this day. They never signed a treaty, and they never were conquered in these skirmishes that were the Seminole Wars. Chief Osceola was the leader of the Seminole War effort. He believed in no surrender because he believed in the sovereignty of the Seminole Nation. But unfortunately, I think the Americans had greater military organization and weaponry, and so he was captured. Well, the Seminoles are dispersed all throughout Florida, and but the majority of them who want to keep their culture alive and maintain the purity of bloodlines. In other words, they don't want to, intermarry and dilute their native bloodlines. They live in South Florida on the Seminole Indian Reservation, which is in the Everglades. It's located in the Everglades. It's just west of Hollywood, Florida, and they do have the Atatiki Museum. You can go down there and you can see their elaborate, very, very extensive museum. Unfortunately, there are no Seminole tribe members organizations here in Central Florida that I know of.